Incident at Hawks Hill by Alan W. Eckert. Chapter 5. There was still an hour of daylight remaining when George Burton alighted from his horse before the MacDonald house on Hawks Hill. The family was on the point of sitting down to dinner, and though Esther shot William an exasperated look, there was nothing to do but invite the bearded trapper to join them. MacDonald was just as irked at his wife, but managed to mask his feelings reasonably well when Burton accepted the invitation with alacrity. It was still a little while before dinner would be on the table, so before eating they all came out to view the large badger Burton had killed. Drawing his bone-handled skinning knife from its belt sheath, Burton severed the cord and tumbled the large gray animal onto the ground with a heavy thud. Only Ben, of the entire family, made no comment congratulating Burton on his catch or admiring the size of the animal. Ben simply stood back a little from the rest, his face pale and devoid of expression. "Really fooled him," Burton boasted. "Got him by both front feet. And badgers ain't the easiest critters to trap, you know. To draw to a trap, neither." Esther and the two girls went back inside the house, but Burton went right on talking as Ben's father and brother remained squatted by the badger, inspecting it. "Kind of hard to figure that this critter's first cousin to a mink. Otter and Martin, though, ain't it? He's like to tore me apart before I clouted him." MacDonald merely grunted while John touched the front paws gingerly and whistled. "Look at the size of those claws, Dad. No wonder they can dig so fast." William MacDonald nodded and used a forefinger to push the upper lip back so the teeth were exposed. One of the canines was chipped at the point and split down its entire length from gnashing against the metal trap, but the array of teeth was still formidable. Burton chuckled. "Knows how to use 'em too, boy," he said. "Teeth and claws both. Don't know nothing else for its size, except maybe a wolverine, that's any fiercer. My dog Lobo, he's big and mean, but he's mighty careful anymore about taking one on. Got real careless once when he was just over being a pup. Tore into one that was caught by hind leg in one of my traps. Never in my born life seen such a ruckus. Old Lobo, he was coming off a bad second best, even though the badger was hung up by the trap. Finally had to step in myself and tap the critter on the head so Lobo could chew him a little easier. Even then, Lobo needed doctoring, and he limped around for a couple of weeks after. Now, like I say, he's right careful. I ain't afraid of him, but he purely respects him these days." The elder MacDonald had pulled out a few hairs from the boy and was studying them closely in the sunset. "Now this is a surprise to me," he commanded. "I always thought their fur was just plain gray, but it's not. Look here, John." As John moved in close to see, he went on. "Notice, right at the bottom here, each hair is gray. But then there's a streak of white, followed by a streak of black. Right out on the end here, it's sort of silver-tipped." Burton grunted, oblivious of the fact that he and his comments had been thus far pretty much ignored. He went on. "Changes color some with the seasons. The face always stays about the same, but the critter's a lot grayer, lighter colored in winter than in summer. This is sort of betwixt and between right now. A few weeks from now, his belly'd be a sort of yeller, instead of whitish like now, and his back'd be browner." "Come to dinner," Esther called from inside the house. The three got to their feet and went to the washstand to clean their hands, then went inside. Ben remained rooted where he was. In a moment his father's voice came. Ben! Ben!" "Go ahead and start serving yourselves," Esther said. "I'll get him." She came outside, saw Ben still standing there, and went to him. She leaned down and slipped her arm around his shoulders and hugged him. "Ben, honey," she said softly, "Mama's got dinner ready now. Aren't you hungry?" Ben shook his head without looking at her. Esther followed his gaze to the dead badger and nodded her understanding. She squeezed him again and kissed his cheek. "I'll put something aside for you, dear, in case you get hungry later on. You can stay outside now if you like." She went back inside, and Ben could hear her explaining to the others that he didn't want to eat, and she had told him he could stay outside. For a while after that, there was only the clink and clatter of tableware and scattered comments. Ben paid no attention to them. For the first time he came close to the dead badger and reached out a hand to it. The fur was coarse, yet soft, but the body was cold and now growing stiff. The badger was on his right side, the right ear hidden from view, and Ben gently rolled it over onto the stomach. He fully expected to see the notched ear, but it was undamaged. He inspected it carefully to be sure. The ear was whole, unmarked. This was not the badger he had encountered out in the prairie, and a wave of relief flooded through him. He sat down beside the big animal now and began gently stroking its fur, making a little crooning sound and occasionally giving voice to a quiet chatter such as the female badger had made. Conversation inside the house was by this time picking up, and though Ben paid little attention to it, it was clearly audible outside. Not surprisingly, Burton was doing most of the talking, and his voice rose and fell, punctuated with bursts of laughter which never quite seemed genuine. Ours ain't as good quality, they tell me, as European badger, but good enough, I reckon. Pelt like that and out there ought to bring in $12, maybe $15. It don't make especially pretty fur, not like otter or beaver, but it's got uses. Coats? John asked. Some. It shucks off the rain pretty good when they tan it with the fur on. Here tell they use some of it to make hand muffs for the ladies back east, and collars for their coats. Mostly use those for shaving brushes. Ain't nothing makes better shaving brushes than badger fur. He barked his mirthless laughter and went on. Used to could just shave off the hair without having the skin on 'em, and you could get $90 a pound for it. Markets back east won't take it no more that way. Though hanged if I can figure out why not. Now they just got to have a whole cured pelt. Can't see as it makes no never mind if they're going to use them for shaving brushes, but that's what they want. They say European badgers got even better fur for 'em, 'cause it's a little stiffer and makes better bristles. But ours is still plenty good. Reckon they're using some for making picture painting brushes for artists, too. Well, I'm glad they're good for something, William MacDonald commented. I've always considered them a complete nuisance. 2 of my horses have broken their legs in badger holes and had to be shot. I guess they make those holes when they're hunting prairie dogs and gophers and the like. Those animals are a nuisance too, but at least the holes are smaller and they have a mound of dirt so you can see it, keep your horse from stepping into it. Conversation inside lagged for a little while, but Ben was still paying no attention to what was being said. The sun had set some time ago and the twilight was deepening. The gray of the badger's body seemed darker, and only the white streak up its snout and over its head still seemed startlingly bright. Lamps had been lighted in the house. There was the sound of dishes being cleared away, and the conversation was picking up again. Burton's voice was unmistakable as it rumbled out. "Man, that was just about the best dinner I ever ate. I'm obliged to you." Esther's reply was inaudible to Ben, but then Burton went on. "Look here, boy," he said, evidently showing something to John. "What is it, Mr. Burton?" "Tooth, boy. Badger fang. Ain't there a lucky piece no better to tote round in your pocket with you than a badger tooth? Most of the Blackfeet, Sioux, and Cheyennes, they wouldn't be without 'em. Figure they're powerful medicine for keeping bad spirits away. Me, I like spirits, and I ain't never been troubled by bad ones yet, so I reckon they're right." He laughed uproariously. "You ever ate badger, MacDonald?" Burton went on after a moment. Ben's father must have shaken his head, because the trapper added, "Well, you sure been missing something. Let me tell you, they aren't hardly no better eating nowheres, especially the hams. They just purely can't be beat at eat. Reckon I'd take badger hams over moose steak any time, and everybody knows you can't hardly get no better than moose steak." "I don't believe I'd much care for it," MacDonald said. He sounded as if he was tired of Burton's loquaciousness, overdone joviality, and somehow insincere friendliness. His chair scraped loudly as he pushed it back, and then the same sound came from the others. "Guess you'd better get to work if you're really planning on skinning the badger here like you said, Burton." He obviously wished the trapper would change his mind and go. "Guess so. You ever skin one?" No, I've skinned a few coyotes and wolves, along with lots of beaver muskrats years ago, but no badgers. Why don't you try your hand on this one? Burton said. Skin him just like you skin a little old muskrat. Go ahead, take a whack at it. MacDonald hesitated, but then John's voice chimed in. Sure, Dad, why not? Try it. I'd like to see you do it. By this time, they were coming out onto the porch, MacDonald carrying a lighted lantern. Though the western sky was still faintly tinged with color, Ben scrambled to his feet and moved off to stop and stand quietly about 20 feet away. He watched as the men walked over to the carcass and stiffened as Burton turned it over onto its back with the toe of his boot. MacDonald set the lantern on the ground close to the hindquarters of the dead animal and then accepted Burton's skinning knife when the man extended it toward him. As his father kneeled by the badger and prepared to slide the blade under the skin close to the body on the inside of one hind leg, Ben's eyes widened. He shrieked and rushed forward, darting between John and Burton, and struck his father's arm, knocking the knife out of his hand. Irritated to begin with at Burton for virtually inviting himself to dinner, and now for inveigling him into skinning the dead badger for him, MacDonald's anger suddenly bloomed and centered itself on Ben. Almost as a reflex action, he struck out at the boy, and his open hand caught Ben on the side of the head. Ben reeled backwards several steps and then fell. John moved to help him up, but Ben scrambled to his feet and raced away to the darkness of the barn, a mournful moaning sound following him all the way. No sense in that, MacDonald said bitterly, berating himself. No sense at all in doing something like that. Burton misunderstood him, and he nodded. Yep, Sprout ought not act such a ways. Nohow. Good thing you clouded him a good one. Reckon if you give him a few good whalins, you'll knock some of that queerness out of him. MacDonald had picked up the knife again, and now he glared up at Burton, no longer masking his feelings. I was talking about myself, he said coldly, not about Ben. I never hit Ben before, and I shouldn't have now. Now when I was mad at something else. John, he turned to his older son, tilting his head toward the barn, go after him and bring him back out with you. Tell him I didn't mean it and I want to apologize. John nodded and strode off toward the barn, paused about halfway there and went back to the house. In a moment he came out again with another lighted lantern and then went into the barn. MacDonald was rapidly skinning the badger, and there was now no conversation between himself and Burton. He slit the skin up the inside of each hind leg, and circled the genitals with an incision that joined one leg skin cut with the other, and then cut a circle around each of the hind paws to free the skin. Grab the feet, he told Burton curtly. The trapper did so, and while he held on tightly, MacDonald gripped the skin and pulled it down, inside out over the animal, as if it were a furry stocking being peeled off. When the carcass was bare to the front paws and head, he similarly encircled those paws with cuts, pulled the skin free from them. It was a little more difficult to free the skin around the ears, eyes, and lips, and by the time skin and carcass were separated, John had come back out of the barn. He no longer carried the lantern with him. Ben's in the back of the third stall, Dad, he said. I told him what you said, but he just shook his head. He won't come out. I didn't think you wanted me to force him. MacDonald sighed. All right, John, thanks. You go on back to the house now. As the youth left them, MacDonald stood and handed the knife handle first to Burton. Then he picked up the skin and wadded it into a ball and tossed it to the trapper. He touched the naked carcass with his foot. Take the carcass with you, too, when you leave, Burton. Without waiting for a reply, he spun around and headed for the barn, wiping his hands on his hips as he did so. Inside the barn, he saw that the lantern John had brought in was standing on the floor at the entrance to the third stall. Then he walked over there. The anger was gone now, replaced by contriteness, which only deepened when he saw his 6-year-old son sitting in a far corner of the stall, his face buried on his knees, his little arms clasped around his lower legs. MacDonald went to the boy and sat on the straw-covered floor beside him. For a little while he said nothing. Then he reached out hesitantly with his hand to touch the boy's hair, but withdrew it before contact was made. He cleared his throat. Ben, he said, you know I didn't mean it. I was angry. Not at you, at Burton. And I just struck out without thinking. I'd never intentionally hurt you, son. There was no response from Ben, no movement. Now MacDonald's gnarled hand came out again, and this time he rested it on the boy's shoulder. He thought he felt the boy cringe, but he wasn't sure. Ben, he said again, I'm sorry. Please believe me. I'm sorry. I guess I know how you must have felt. I should have realized. Can you forgive me? Still there was no response, and MacDonald exhaled audibly, and his hand slid off Ben's shoulder. He stood and looked down at his son, how small he was, and how big he himself must appear to the boy. He wished desperately that he could do something, say something to make Ben respond, to open up communication between them, but he just didn't know what to do or say. He sighed again and walked to the stall entry, where he paused and looked back. Ben hadn't moved. Expect your mother'll be in after a bit, son. Esther and John were sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for him when MacDonald came in. The girls had evidently been sent to bed. William shook his head, and he dropped to one of the chairs. He put his elbow on the table and cupped the sides of his head in his hands. They said nothing. He's so small, Esther, he said after a moment. Somehow I just never realized how very small he is. Not till tonight. And I hit him. I actually hit him. My God, Esther, what kind of a brute am I to hit a baby? Esther rose and came to stand behind his chair, putting her hands on his shoulders. She leaned over and kissed the top of his head. I know, Will, I know. Sometimes things happen. We shouldn't let them, but we do. I know you didn't mean it. Did you talk with him? He shook his head. With him? No. To him? As always, to him. He just sat. Didn't talk, didn't move, wouldn't even look at me. I told him I was sorry, but I just couldn't get through to him, Esther. Believe me, I do love Ben. More, I think, than I ever realized. But I just can't seem to communicate with him. Is it me, Esther? Is there something the matter with me that I can't even talk with my own son? He'll come around, Esther said softly. You'll see. It just takes time, that's all. Time and understanding, and a lot of patience. More patience sometimes than we think we can give. He'll come around, though. Sure he will, Dad, John interjected. Don't you worry. But the glance that John and his mother shared at that moment made it evident that neither was any longer quite so sure of it at all. They lapsed into silence, and after a little while, Esther spoke quietly. I'll go out and see to Ben now. And that's the end of chapter 5.